Welcome everyone to the Becky's Anonymous live stream. This is June 2021, and in honor of Juneteenth and our ongoing conversation about the economics of abolition, we have with us today a great guest, Boston City Councilor Ricardo Arroyo, who's going to help us talk through and discuss specifically reparations and its role in the economics of abolition, really being able to understand what this means at the municipal level. And we'll touch on particularly how white women can be a part of being part of this movement to really take this important step towards racial justice. And so thank you so much, Councilor Arroyo, for being here. I'm sure many of our viewers know you already, but I want to share just a little bit of your bio and definitely want to invite you to add anything. But Ricardo was born in Hyde Park, where he was raised by his parents, Felix D. Arroyo, a former Boston City Councilor and the current Register of Probate for Suffolk County, and Elsa Montano, a retired Boston public school teacher. From a young age, his parents rooted him in a love of service and a responsibility to give back to the community. As a public defender, Ricardo has fought for those that are often unseen and unheard. As a city councilor, he now does that for the communities that raised him. He believes we can achieve stronger economies, quality schools, affordable housing, safe neighborhoods, and healthy communities when we put people first by making sure that all people are seen and all voices are heard. Ricardo sits on the board of the National Lawyers Guild Massachusetts chapter and is a member of the Boston Bar Association, Massachusetts Bar Association, NAACP, and Mijente, a political home for Latinx and Chicanx people who seek racial, economic, gender, and climate justice. And so welcome to the space, and thank you so much for being here. I don't know first if there's anything you wanted to add to that bio. But then we can jump into our reparations conversation.
Yeah, we can jump right in. That bio's
awesome. Very cool. Well, thank you again for being here. And we're going to start with, I know that you were at the June 9th, 2021 hearing that was held by Boston City Councilors Julia Mejia and Kenzie Bach, who held a hearing for reparations. And you gave some great testimony. I wanted to just open us up with a quote we pulled from that hearing about describing really what does reparations mean. So we'd love to start with that quote, and then we'd love to hear from you kind of that hearing and what more to you does reparations really mean. So this is a quote from that hearing. Restitution, which seeks to restore a victim for their position before the violations occurred. Compensation, which is a financial award for harms. Rehabilitation, which seeks to provide care and services for victims beyond monetary payment. Satisfaction, which includes symbolic reparations such as public apologies and verifying facts. And guarantee of non-repetition, which assures us that this kind of harm shall never be repeated. So would love to hear from you first. Obviously, there's this harm we're talking about, and I think sometimes we assume that we all know what that harm is, but we'll love to hear from you, your opinion about that. But then really understanding when we talk about reparations, you know, this quote kind of defines it a little bit more. What do we really mean? So we'd love to hear from you what that means, particularly in this Boston context, and particularly what this legislation means to you.
Perfect. So first thing, we haven't had the hearing yet, actually. So folks can participate in that hearing. That was the filing for a hearing. And so there'll be one as soon as we get a date and a schedule for that. I'll make sure that folks get that so that they can actually come and comment in that hearing, attend that hearing. Because we just recently signed, the governor just recently signed the Zoom is still good ordinance, basically, where we're able to do it online. So there's ways for folks to engage on that. So actually, if you're watching this and you're like, I really want to have a say on that, or I really want to push an elected official on that, you still can. In terms of the harm and what we're talking about, you know, we live in a society that sort of is systems upon systems. And sometimes because we exist in it, it's very easy to lose track of the fact that a lot of it, like when we talk about systemic racism or we talk about systems, what that means And what that really means is there's systems to almost everything you do. There's systems to the schools you go to. There's systems to the healthcare you get. There's systems to how your street is cleaned or not cleaned or provided for. And in this country, the bedrock of all of our systems is a racial hierarchy. And whether or not we want to, you know, I think everybody here understands that that exists and that there's been harm perpetrated by that. And I would hope everybody here understands that that harm has not stopped being inflicted. We have not gotten to a place where in this day and age, today, whatever the actual date of today is, I think it's the 20th of June, 2021, we haven't stopped living in a racial hierarchy system where our systems are sort of built to benefit and this is really important too, to intentionally harm people of color, specifically Black Americans. And that comes from slavery, the roots of slavery, the justifications for slavery, how we did that for hundreds of years and how that was allowed to sort of be ingrained into not just our government structures, but our banking structures, our mortgage structures, our home ownership structures, everything that we do, every kind of law that you can think of. For instance, property law. If you go to school for property law, if you're a lawyer watching this, you're very familiar with the very first case you learn is that Native Americans can't own land. And so the whole purpose of our systems and structures was to create a racial hierarchy, a white racial hierarchy where white being white on top. And over time, you know, whether you were Italian or Irish or you came with a different immigrant, a German or a different immigrant set, you know, you were able to find your way into assimilation in America because you were white. So whether or not you were initially on the outside, as other European white communities have had in America, the common ground is whiteness and white supremacy. And over time, they've done a really good job assimilating and sort of removing these other cultures into just a general demographic that has sort of benefited from these systems over time. And so we could talk about that because it's a big subject. There's a lot of different ways in which, you know, slavery as the original sin in this country continues to impact us today, and why these kinds of ideas like reparations at a municipal level make a lot of sense.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And definitely through our different live streams and through our circles, we keep returning to kind of what are the data points that show us, and particularly in the Boston context, we've talked a lot about the wealth gap and that $8 versus $250,000. And we've thought a lot about, I really appreciate you bringing up the property thing, because we as white women have been reflecting a lot as inheritors, as gentrifiers, what really is our role in this. And I would love to kind of, you know, you represent a very diverse district that includes a lot of white women in those roles, and would love to hear, you know, a lot of times we get this conversation, you know, I'm on board for reparations, but what does that actually look like? And so one of the reasons we were so excited to have you on was to really get the sense of, you know, on the municipal level, like what would this really look like? What does this look like to you? How does a diverse district like the one you represent, how does everybody kind of be a part of this in a good way? So
a couple questions I'm trying to unpack. And I talk with my hands. So if folks are like seeing my fingers move around, that's when I'm into a topic. And so specifically, when it comes to reparations at a municipal level, right, I think it's really important to understand that there's certain advantages that people who may or may not, you know, and I'm just going to tackle this from the standpoint of folks that are generally actually oppositional to the idea of reparations. And they're oppositional generally to the idea of reparations on this idea or basis that slavery was a long time ago. I didn't own slaves, right? Maybe my family came from Europe, they didn't own slaves. So what's the big deal? Here's the big deal. In this country, there's generational wealth. There's all kinds of different systems, the GI Bill, for instance, or redlining, which was when people were being essentially having their housing and property values just desecrated because they were people of color, and so that they could actually block by block bust them out. And so there's a number of different things that we have experienced to this day, right? Gentrification, displacement continue. But when you have savings, when you have sort of this idea in America of pulling yourself up from your bootstraps, or this sort of rugged individualism, the reality is most folks that are wealthy in this country are wealthy because their parents were wealthy, because they've inherited wealth. And when you think about 400 years of forced labor, where you have folks, and I'm not even talking about the horrors of slavery, which if you were trying to compensate for that, I don't even know how you would put together what those metrics are. And just so folks, if you're wondering what those horrors are, having your children sold from you, being raped and losing children, having your parents or your family sold away, losing your entire cultural identity because you were essentially kidnapped from your country and brought here to do forced labor, or being born into slavery and being denied the right to an education, and all these different things that have happened. So if you were trying to quantify that, how could you even begin? But in terms of just simple principles like the idea of passing down wealth, well, those folks, those enslaved people, were creating wealth for not just plantation owners and in that industry, but those goods were getting transported up north here, for instance, in Massachusetts. Our shipping industry, which we have to this day, actually, a pretty strong shipping industry. That shipping industry was a lot of the bedrock of the shipping industry for enslaved people. And so we also had auction blocks and things like that too. We weren't that far removed. But then cotton that was coming from the north was also coming to our Lowell mills, our different places in Massachusetts. And so this wealth that folks were generating, not just in the South, but also in the North, that they were generating off of literally the capture of and kidnapping of Black people and the labor of Black people, they didn't have savings. They weren't able to build up in that wealth. And so they were not only not being employed, but all that wealth that they generated, that those families then left for their families, that created industries, that then created work that people of color were blocked out of getting. When you get into that world, you have very much benefited from those systems and structures. And so how do we make that right? I don't know that there's a sum that anybody could come up with that would make sense. Evanston, Illinois, which is one of the places that was cited here, used the marijuana industry in Illinois. They used the tax. They taxed it, and they created a reparations fund that I believe is supposed to get up to about $10 million, but initially has been seeded with $400,000. And their idea was, at a municipal level, what if we make it so that there's $25,000 available to families with a history or heritage of slavery, of being enslaved, having access to $25,000 for home purchase or home repair. And that's a start, right? I wouldn't call that the end all be all, but that's the kind of creative thinking that it requires. And I think when folks think about this, the idea is that this is just free money, or this is money being given to people who aren't impacted. But the reality is the impact's not just of slavery, because if you just ended it there, then sure, that's a weird way to look at history. But after that, what ended up happening is a complete separate and unequal system for this country, where the racial hierarchy of that was people of color didn't have access to the same goods or mortgages or banks or jobs or education, for instance. And so when you do all of that and you systematically do that, and we're not talking about that far away, we're talking about within, people's parents' grandparents' lifetimes, right? Like, this is not that far back down the line. There are people whose great grandparents were literally enslaved Americans. And so we're not talking about a very long time ago. When you look at what we need to do to make that right, there has to be some financial compensation. There has to be some access to equity in wealth building. And in a place like Boston, a perfect example of kind of the issue with this, Boston has a net worth for white families, and this was a couple years ago, so it's probably worse, to be perfectly honest, of $250,000 for a white family, $8 for a Black family. That is the inheritance of that sort of system and of that racial wealth gap. But then there's another place that's municipal that folks don't often think about, which is how our government spends their money. So when you pay your taxes, we usually hire folks to do contracting. We contract folks out to do certain jobs, whether that's landscaping, whether that's catering, whether that's printing that pamphlet that the city gave you to tell you about a COVID vaccination site, whether it's an advertising campaign or computers or whatever they're doing that they're purchasing. 99%, it's actually 99.8% of our contracts went to white men. And so when you think about that, it's about $600 million plus for folks who are trying to calculate that. And when you get that on a scale, it's not just at a city level, it's every city, it's every state. And so when you do that, the money that they're generating in terms of Boston and residents of color for the city through taxes aren't being reciprocated back to them in the creation of their own industry and the creation of their own companies. They usually are going to white companies that have the footing or the ability or the size to take those contracts because of generational wealth that has allowed them to scale up in a way that we haven't seen in communities of color. And then the common refrain is that we don't have, communities of color don't have businesses owned by people of color who can qualify for these contracts because they're not sized up enough. Well, where did that happen? How did that happen? Why it doesn't happen accidentally? And so when we get to, where we are now and where we do it, I would actually say a creative way, this hasn't come up, but for a hearing, I think a creative way to do reparations is to ensure that when we're investing money as a city, that we do require and we do give priority specifically to people who have been impacted by slavery's businesses when we're giving those contracts out. And I think that's something that it's interesting. We're not allowed to do, anybody who's been following the BPS, Boston Public Schools situation with our exam schools, you may know that there's been a change in the format in which people enter into our selected admission schools. And that recently came under suit by white and Asian families, and that was tossed out. But the reason that it came under suit is we're not allowed to do racial quotas. And so as we get into how do you correct a harm that was specifically based on racial hierarchy, how do you go about creating that if you're not allowed to implicitly and directly and intentionally isolate for those things? And I would say that's a version of systemic racism, again, sort of self-protecting and ensuring that, well, no, you can't have a racial-based quota because that would be wrong. So we're just going to have a racial-based quota that benefits people who are not people of color, who are white, because that's just how the system's played out now. And so you can preserve that racial quota that is created by systems of economic harm, of community harm, of actual harm in terms of how we spend our resources in communities and which schools receive resources and which ones don't, which communities have access to private testing or the funds for that and which ones don't. You can create a system and kind of enforce that and keep that, that's fair game. If I went there and said, it's systemically racist because it's doing this, they would actually say, well, there's no racial quota. It's just getting that outcome on its own. But if I came in and said, well, I want a racial quota to ensure that people of color, specifically Black, Latino, folks are represented in these numbers in a way that is equivalent to the actual numbers of this population for the city of Boston, that would actually be struck down. And the reality is our legal systems sort of enforce that. And so we have to think creatively about how we go about circumventing sort of the ways that our systems enforce and keep in place these systemic inequalities. That was a lot. So I don't know where you want to go with that, but that was a lot of a lot of information.
Well, I think the overall message I got from that is real, and I want to continue to unpack it, is really appreciating that reparative actions are not like this complementary, how you're really getting at, like our whole tax system in itself needs to be restorative, because if it's not, it just continues to support the exact system, white supremacist systems that we're trying to undermine. And so I think it's super helpful for our audience to think about, I really appreciate the call to think about how can people, who are from this area be a part of those hearings, and also thinking about, and we have people not from this area thinking about how they can be maybe part of hearings that are happening in their community. But more importantly, this idea that this isn't just one hearing conversation, or this conversation isn't just when we talk about specifically reparations. This is the start to how do we entirely look at our whole system as reparative, and really appreciated you pointing out these many, many other examples of how, one, the very scary statistics of how far we are from that, but I think also I appreciate your really concrete examples of opportunities, like the contracting. That's a ridiculous statistic, but here's the opportunity. And again, how are we looking and being open to all of those opportunities, particularly as white women? And I think particularly we as white women need to think about how a lot of times these situations are going to be about us giving up power, or giving up resources, or giving up, or what can feel like that. For a lot of it, I'll say for people in our community, it feels like that. And I think what we're trying to couple with that is, what are we also saying yes to in that? What is the cost to us in these white supremacist structures that we we sort of also experience at the cost of us buying into this sort of white privilege system. So I would love to hear from you as you think about particularly centering the harm that's been done to very particular populations in our history, the continued harm that it's happening right now, and how in this sort of discussion, I would love to hear kind of that reparative relationship building as well that comes into this. Like, how does activism around these things, how does that kind of affect also the community relationships? Again, you know, like if this is passed and implemented, how do you think it's going to impact all of the people in your district, for example? How will it change the community dynamics, you think, kind of in your district?
So here's sort of the crux of it, which I think is what you're trying to get to in terms of what makes it difficult to get these kinds of things done. Theoretically, equal access or equal rights doesn't mean less rights or less access for you. In practice, these inequities and these inequalities have a beneficiary, a very specific beneficiary, when you get into how they were constructed in all of the different systems in place. Whether it's how we generate wealth, how we create access, who had access to those first-time homebuyer programs when they came back from World War II, who had access to these scholarships for schools, why certain neighborhoods received the funding they did and which ones didn't, why they were price chopped down in terms of what their property values were. So they did have homes, but then we're going to make sure, or we're going to sort of artificially construct a negative property value for that. So if they do leave that for somebody else, it's not worth much. Or now with displacement in terms of gentrification, we're now going to create it where, yes, you have this property value if you bought a home. You know, if, for instance, in my district, I have Mattapan, which is, I believe, the most Black district in the city of Boston. It's the most Black neighborhood is Mattapan by the numbers. It's not Roxbury, it's Mattapan. And it's also a very heavily home ownership neighborhood. But when you get in there, you're talking about folks who bought those homes in the 70s, in the 80s for a fraction of what they cost now. And so, yes, they can sell that home now because of Boston's wild home pricing situation. And they can get some money off of that actually feels like a certain amount of money. But if you have children in this city, they're not going to be able to then go out and purchase homes in Boston. They're not going to, in some cases, be even able to afford the rent in these places. And so when we're talking about comparatively what this looks like from a generational wealth standpoint, it comes to play in a really painful way for some neighborhoods. But I think what we're trying to get to, which is specifically, and I'll use the BPS selective admission school process because it's a perfect example. When that happened, on paper and theoretically, I think most white families want more access for communities of color. They want more access for folks who have been excluded, especially folks who have been excluded not because they have any issues with the rigor or the merit, but because our systems have made it easier for their children and their families to be excluded from that process. And then when we created something that essentially did that, there was a course correction. And that course correction was less white families had access to these selective admission schools, which meant that some parents had children who they wanted to be in these selective admission schools, their own children, who were not. And I think there was a reckoning there where they realized, well, that system was more beneficial for me. That system that was in place actually benefited me, gave me an advantage, whether they want to call it that or not. It gave me an advantage. And so now my child, stripped of that advantage, doesn't have entry. How's that impact my child? How's that impact my life? And then you go from sort of this macro focus to this micro focus. And I think part of this is just being realistic about the fact that when a system is built to benefit a specific race, when all of the systems have systematically done that, when we correct that, that means that those advantages go away. Does that mean that now everything's equal? Actually, yes. But what that means is that those systems are going to correct themselves in a way where you may have received benefits, you may have received access to things, not based on anything in particular. You may have had a skill set, you may have had access for all these different reasons. It's not that you weren't qualified, but once you open it up, it turns out there were a lot of folks that were qualified who weren't receiving that access. And so you are going to have to give something up. And it's the giving of something up that I think has sort of over time gotten incredibly in the way in how we move forward as a country when it comes to race. And frankly, most of the gains that come from race aren't come from this sort of, in terms of addressing systemic racism, they don't come from this sort of kumbaya, yes, we're going to make these changes voluntarily. They usually come by court order. They don't come by sort of a realization that, hey, these systems are oppressive, not just to other folks of color, but to me. I am actually benefiting from a system of oppression. What does that do to me morally, consciously? How do I engage with that? What does that mean for me in terms of how I move forward? Am I going to be silent to those advantages? Am I going to be silent to those wrongs? And if I am going to decide not to be silent to those wrongs, if I'm going to put a Black Lives Matter sign on my yard, am I going to treat it that way when it comes to making sure that we actually systemically make these changes that may not benefit me? And when I say that, what I mean is it's obviously beneficial to you morally, from a conscious decision, from how it helps a city actually become a better, stronger city municipally, from a community perspective. But it may actually mean that you have less access to something that previously you may have taken for granted, or may have just been something that you did have access to without, to the exclusion of others, without even consciously knowing it. And whether or not you're willing to accept that or not is a really difficult conversation, I think, for a lot of folks. And so when it gets to reparations, one of the things that constantly surprises me is that reparations can be a buzzword, can be sort of a third rail. For instance, I shared the remarks that I made when this was introduced to the floor about sort of the historic harms of this. And the minute some folks heard reparations, it was like hate mail in the inbox. And the thing about that is, that's insane. If we're talking about slavery, if we're talking about the kidnapping of families, the rape and pillaging of families, the murder, we left that part out, the systemic murder of an entire race of people in this country, yeah, they're probably entitled to reparations. I mean, we've given reparations for Japanese internment camps. We know Holocaust survivors have gotten a form of reparations. And yet when it comes to the original sin of this country, when it comes to the economic expansion and what this country was able to do, and for folks who, I was in history classes in PPS where they would say that, slavery wasn't that big an engine for our economic power as a country. And to that, that's actually BS. It's actually the foundation of it. It was so important to the economic foundations of this country that consciously the folks that are referred to as the founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, did their very hardest to ensure that we never touched that enterprise. They did their very hardest to ensure that those things were kept in place in a specific way, because financially it didn't just benefit the South, it benefited the North, it benefited our shipping, it benefited a number of things. And frankly, when it came time to discuss the end of slavery in general, it was termed as a competitive advantage. If you stopped doing slavery, but France or England didn't, for instance, then they would benefit from that labor. It was always understood what the economic powerhouse of slavery meant and was. And so when we talk about this country and what it means, we have an enormous amount of wealth. And when people think about it as tax cuts, for instance, they can take an opinion one way or the other about corporate tax cuts for the middle class. They understand that that wealth is generated by its people. But when we talk about slavery and the wealth that was generated from that has never actually been reciprocated or trickled down to or given to specifically communities of color and the people who earned that, who created that wealth, who built that wealth, that is wild. That's a step too far. That for me has always been an example of systemic oppression and white supremacy in action. The idea of reparations should be the furthest thing from a difficult thing to get your head around that exists. And yet for some folks, they think of that like it's some radical idea. And I don't understand how you could base that on the idea of radicalism, for instance, or that's some pie in the sky idea, unless you're operating from a place of white supremacy. It doesn't make sense that you would kill, enslave, rape, murder for 400 plus years and think that a financial reparation to that is somehow insane. And so from that perspective, I try to operate from the world of what does justice look like here? And for me, justice looks like being very intentional in how we're allowed to engage. I can't create a federal system. I'm a city councilor. I can't change the way that our federal government or our state government is working. But municipally, what creative things can we do? Whether it's how we disperse our money, how we give out our money, how we create access for programming. what specific things can we do, not as the end all be all of reparations, but supplementary to, because there are multiple ways in which folks should receive reparations. It shouldn't just be, here's, Evanston, I hope, didn't create a $25,000 purchase a home, repair your home fund with the idea that we did it, guys, we finished reparations and we're done. There has to be a full accounting for that. And I think that's multifaceted. And I think for me, when I think about it, what I think about is, what does it take to gain equal footing again? What does it take to break these systems of oppression that have created uneven footing, that have created a situation where in Boston, the average white family might have $250,000 of net worth, but the average black family has $8. You might have remembered that I told you that black homeowners live in Mattapan. So if net worth, for folks that are paying attention, it's not just what your assets are, it's what your debts are. Why do these families have and carry more debt? Where did that come from? Why does that exist? Why do these families not? Where did that come from? Where does that exist? What does it take municipally for us to even that out? Until that's evened out, I don't think we've done our job. It's not a one, here's a one thing and we're done. We did reparations, everybody, high five all the way around. I think it's a intentional act that's going to take possibly multiple lifetimes to make sure that we create the systems that actually profit and embolden and empower entire communities that we've locked out of success. And so those are, it's the year 2021. We have our first black woman mayor, right? Black and woman mayor in the year 2021 in the city of Boston. What does that look like? Why is that true? Why do electeds of color have less money running comparatively to white politicians? Why does that exist? It usually exists because they have access to different levels of donors and different levels of money. And so when you get into the data, all the data shows you what you need to know. And I'll just say, earlier this year in February or March, my first act as a city councilor was racism as a public health crisis, which got picked up in a bunch of different places. And the reason that was such a no-brainer for me was every health indicator that we have, whether it's diabetes, heart disease, infant mortality, Black and Latino families in the city of Boston are dead last. They have the worst outcomes. And when they did this study, the Boston Public Health Commission, what they recognized is they have 21 what they call social determinants of health. So that's your environment, that's your house, that's your transportation, that's your job, that's all these different things that might be a determinant of your health. It turns out that racism impacts every single one of those. And the actual acts of racism, so when I say racism and public health crisis, I'm not just talking about an act of racism to me, but it turns out that when somebody does do something racist to somebody, there is a measurable health impact that they can actually measure to their blood pressure, to the anxiety, to their actual health outcomes. And so when you talk about that, when we talk about how this society is literally killing Black and Latino people at a rate that is disproportionate to any other population today as we speak, and what systems create that, this is a no-brainer. Reparations is a no-brainer, but also just these conversations and these topics. And the question is, what do you have to give up individually to make that a reality? What do you have to give up? Is it going to bother you that there's some money that you're paying into that you don't have access to, that's going specifically to people like who were impacted by slavery or who are ancestors of slavery? When you get into that, it shouldn't, but in this society, that has not traditionally been the case. And so generally speaking, part of what we would be looking at as we craft these things is, how do you also make it so that it'll stand up in a court of law, because our systems are not created to actually deal with race in the way that they should. They're not actually the idea for our court systems, and I was a public defender before this, the idea of the court system is that they should be race neutral or race blind. And the problem is they're not, and also our systems aren't. And so if our systems aren't race neutral, if our systems aren't race blind, and it's okay for them to continue, the idea for them is the system as it operates, if there's some kind of hiccup in it where somebody literally says, we're excluding people because they're Black, we're excluding people because they're Latino, well, we'll fix that. But if the system is so ingrained that they're not doing exclusion purposefully, but instead it's just the impact of all of the buildup of systemic inequality over generations that creates unequal outcomes, they're not really built to address that. And if you say, I want to intentionally ensure through a quota system, for instance, that we're reversing that damage, that we're reversing that harm, that we're creating that access, our court systems actually say that's racist. And so when we get into how we do these kinds of things, there's also another look at that where, you know, I have learned in my very young life that our system is built to, you know, if racism was something that could be solved in one lifetime, I do believe we would have solved it. There were some incredibly intelligent and still are civil rights leaders and folks who were pushing on these things, but it's not. It's a self-sustaining system. And so when you pull sort of the Jenga block out over here, there might be another thing coming in on the other side that holds that up. And you have to do multiple things over multiple, I would actually say over multiple generations to really remedy that, because the systems that we are founded on and created on are in every single thing that you can think of, whether it's our city charter, our state charter, our constitution, the way that we elect leaders, the way that our Congress and Senate work, the way that the presidency works, the way that our three systems of bureaucratic government work, whether it's the judicial system or the executive, all of that, down to the policing and how we allow that to continue and to multiply. And so, you know, it can be overwhelming. And I think the thing that I would say, speaking specifically to folks who are white and watching this, is that understanding the multitude of ways in which this harm is caused and created, where can you fit in, where can you get in? And it's going to have to be a lot more than symbolic. I'm just going to tell you that. And the way that you get there is when you see things like this, you should probably be lifting it up. You should probably be talking to folks about it. You should probably be saying this should happen. And that requires real action. I will tell you, as an elected official, the only thing that I've ever seen anybody in this office respond to, and includes myself, is pressure. It's the idea of, how do I get into that person's inbox? If we're talking about something at a municipal level, at a reparations level, I know I spoke. I know other people spoke. Who didn't? Maybe you should call them. I didn't see a single, you know, there's certain places where you need to put pressure to make somebody understand that this is something that you need to get done. And I think we saw that last year with our budgeting, where there was a call to defund police, and we did get some cuts. They weren't significant enough. I actually voted against that budget. But in terms of any cuts happening at all, that didn't happen because I said I need this. That happened because a mass amount of people said they needed that. And it's going to take that kind of sustained pressure and focus and intensity to get these kinds of things done too. There's a reason why this is a hearing, just so that we can start to set up the groundwork for an eventual push to an actual program. But the minute a program, some kind of reparations program, hits the table, I promise you that the folks who don't want that will mobilize incredibly hard. And the question for you is, how will you mobilize, and in what ways are you mobilizing right now to ensure that when that day does come, we can move past just having a hearing into something substantive? What is it going to take to get something substantive passed? Because, you know, there's mechanisms of media, whether it's radio or newspapers or other things, that are going to take aim directly at the fact that this is a reparations program. And just going back to what I was talking about, where the idea of reparations is somehow radical and doesn't make any sense. That's the kind of lack of nuance that we end up having on a mainstream level. And when most folks are struggling to survive and to live and make it day to day, they often don't have the energy or the ability to engage in our systems. And if you're watching this, then you're not really in that framework. And so you should be engaging, you should be lifting that up. That was a lot. I mean, I'm not sure how much cues you need to give me, but we could go.
We could go for another hour and a half, but I think this is a great kind of pausing point and kind of touch on this before we totally end, because this is really the meat of kind of what on Wednesday, all of our audience hopefully is going to join us on Wednesday to unpack that even more, about specifically what is the role of white women in doing everything that you just said. How do we make sure we're being intentional about, because often white women, when we hear that invitation, we run with, okay, this is how I think it should be done, and I'm going to be the person, you know, doing my testimony about reparations. And I think it's figuring out how do we not step in that way, and really think about how do we uphold reparations as this is something that we want to be a part of, being the pillars of having this conversation and pushing that conversation. But how are we making sure that it's really about how we're opening those spaces and those doorways for people to speak for themselves, and most importantly, to define what exactly does reparations, what is it going to look like? You know, to your point of, there are very clear data points that will tell us if we're doing what we need to do. You know, you've listed many of them already, and getting there is, again, it's, you know, I appreciate your point of kind of, it's the end and the process, right? Like we need to be simultaneously thinking about how we're doing a reparative process of figuring out how to really do reparations in a good way. And I think white women are in this position to either really cause harm and shut the door on that, you know, direction, or really being a part of really upholding this, and really pushing this term as something that we need to lean into as communities. I really appreciate too, the point of any progress that has happened has not been by the kumbaya moments. It's been, like, as you said, about, you know, it being taken to court and people being forced in some ways to do what they need to do. And I think that that is also the case with us white women, very, very much so. And so I do want to share this kind of quote before we end, and want to hear your thoughts about this. And this is from Coretta Scott King. About this struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You earn it and win it in every generation. And so want to just appreciate, I think you highlighted that. I think that we want to appreciate you also as someone who is taking, you know, what you have already done in your short time that you are already in office has really pushed the conversation already so many steps forward. And I really appreciate the moment for us to think as white women about how we're really trying to be a part of building those building blocks right now, and understanding that, you know, I appreciate when we think about particularly reparations and we think about why we need them, they're not going to be comfortable. You know, I really appreciate you really being, you know, what is the history we're really talking about? What is the harm we're really talking about? And if we, as white women or other people, think that we're going to get through this in a way that's going to always feel comfortable to us, that's being super disrespectful to kind of what is the legacy that we're talking about. Of course, the history we're talking about, and repairing that is not going to be an easy or comfortable process. So want to thank you for being here. Want to hear your moments, your thoughts again on just this topic of how do we continue this fight every day. And again, heard some concrete things that you asked us to do. I want to summarize those real quick. But also want to hear anything added. I heard really this concrete ask to really show up for this hearing that so awesomely people still have the opportunity to be a part of. Thinking about how you're opening that space up for other people, and we'll talk more in our circle very concretely about what that participate, the vast range of ways to participate in that. But I also heard people maybe who aren't represented by you, but are represented by other people, that question of what did you say about this, encouraging them to say something about it. For those of you who are maybe not in the Boston area, figuring out who's talking about reparations. Why aren't people talking about reparations? How can you bring up this word in more spaces, and educating yourself on when you bring up that word, what are you really meaning? And so, yeah. So anything else, Councilor Roy, that you think would be?
The Coretta Scott King, there's different versions and variations of it. You know, the former Governor Deval Patrick had a saying where he said, you know, the fight for justice is a relay race. Our job is to take the baton and move it further and then hand it off. The idea that this kind of moves beyond you. And I've often grappled with the reality that, you know, this won't happen in my lifetime. It may not happen in my children's lifetime. But what am I doing right now to make their burden a little bit easier when we get there, right? What's radical today isn't always radical tomorrow. And that's done a lot by the work. I also kind of want to reinforce, because I didn't say it, but you did. That's a good thing to reinforce. When I'm asking folks to lean in, I'm not asking you to take on leadership spaces that should be held by people of color. What I'm asking you to do is lift those efforts up and engage with those systems. But I'm also going to say this. There's an issue with allyship where you're coming to the choir to tell them we agree with this. I don't need that. What I need from you is to go into the fire and to go and convert. And in a lot of times when we talk about American systems, access to rooms is really different. The access that I have to certain rooms is very different than the access that you might have as a white woman to certain rooms. And when we're in those rooms, are we being shy about these issues because these are issues we only talk about with our allies and people of color, or are we engaging in the spaces that we have the privilege to be in a way that other folks aren't given access? I'm asking you to do that. I'm asking you to go into those spaces that people of color are excluded from or do not have access to, and to lift up the banner there and do the fight and the work there, because we don't have access to that. I'm not asking you to come to where the choir is and say, I agree with this. This is great. And then go back home to those systems and sort of not speak to it. And so that's one of the places where I think you have a lot of power. One of the issues with this system is that it ingratiates power in demographics of race and where those power dynamics exist. And so by the very benefit of being born white in America, you have advantages that other folks don't have, that are systemic, that are access, and who has access to what. And so when you're looking at like concrete ways to engage, it does matter that you engage with your elected officials in communities that are not as diverse as mine. It does matter that you engage with communities, and specifically that don't have that diversity and are not having those conversations, because it matters that they hear it from folks like you. It matters that they have that voice. It matters a lot less, frankly, than I hear from you, because I'm already doing this work. I don't need anybody else to tell me to go and do this work. But I do need you to go tell people who are getting in the way of me doing this work. And that's a different thing. And so when we're talking about action steps, that's certainly one of them. And so, from that perspective, just to kind of bring it back to where we're at, because you talked about touch points for measurement. I can measure inequity really easily. It's actually, almost anybody can. And when you look at the data points, it's very specific. By that same metric, what I've always said is, if we can create systems of white supremacy, if we can create these systems that last literally generations, then you can do the opposite. You can create systems of equity, systems of justice that create sort of a cascading impact that 2, 3, 4 generations from now, our children's children are benefiting from. The same way you can create systems of inequity and systems of racial oppression or white supremacy that we have been experiencing to this day. You could do the opposite too. That's why I'm in politics. It's not just to dismantle these systems, because that's a lot of it. It's harm reduction, it's dismantling systems, but it's also creating brand new systems that imagine or see a way for us to create actual systems. And here's what I mean by that. Ricardo Arroyo is the councilor for District 5. I'm going to fight for racial equity issues, racial justice issues, until I no longer draw breath or sit in this seat. The next person who has this seat may or may not do that. That is not a system. That is me. It's dependent on a good person. We have a DA, for instance, in Rachel Rollins, who has decided to go after sort of what we call progressive prosecution. A new DA could come in and strip all of that stuff out, because all of that comes down to the DA's prosecutorial discretion. It's not systemic, it's her. If she's gone, somebody else can come in and just dismantle all of that, because what she's doing is she's using her judgment and her discretion. It literally lives and dies with her. When we talk about systems, those systems shouldn't matter who's in charge. Just like systems of white supremacy and white racial hierarchy hasn't mattered who the president is, who the senators are, who the congressmen are, who your counselors are, because those systems operate every day in a specific way that create that inequity. And so, as we do this, I also am asking folks not just to engage in the work of dismantling, but to engage in the work of lifting up and creating systems, not just people or ideas or thoughts that are kind of one-offs, but systems, things that last, things that stand the test of time, that create equity moving forward. And that's part of what I think we can try to do with a reparations program.
So I think our circle on Wednesday is pretty much just going to start with the last couple of minutes of what you just laid out for us, because I think it's such a crucial part for white women to pick this conversation up internally and talking, amongst ourselves. Because I really appreciate that point of if we've built these systems, and I say we because we know white women. If we look at the lost cause, if we look at what happened in the second election for Trump, it was white women who consolidated and came together, and exactly, and it was them who came together and consolidated and helped in these moments where we saw maybe some cracks in the system. They came together and upheld and, you know, made sure that system continued. And so how do we as white women do that in a very different way, as you just outlined?
Even in that, right, I think the conversations coming off of that were, how do we get you? So there was a real betrayal, I think, from a feminist standpoint of Hillary Clinton with that Donald Trump election, where the conversation was, how did you choose your whiteness over your womanhood? And that's a conversation that I think, imagine now when you're not choosing either, where you're literally choosing something for a entirely different demographic that may in fact be good for womanhood, because women of color, by the way, when we talk about equal pay or any of those statistics, way off, different things, right? So when we talk about access and things like that, even within the, you know, this is a patriarchal society, even within patriarchy, racial hierarchy plays a role. And so when we talk about that, I would love for y'all to unpack that, because it's one of those things where, you know, in America, even if you don't identify as racist, even if you don't necessarily are even aware of your privilege, you're aware of your whiteness. And I think there's a question of how are we going to dismantle that? Because you may say, oh, white supremacy, I don't like that. That sounds really bad. I'm not for that. But when it comes time for us to actually create an equal entry to, say, our selective admission schools, and white supremacy was ensuring that your children maybe got 2 or 3 different benefits that made it so that they had an advantage to that, and now it's made less so, how are you going to react to the loss of what white supremacy was giving you? And I think with Donald Trump, what we saw was people really leaned into, I like the benefits of being white in a white racial hierarchy, even if I'm not going to say that. And the way that a lot of that was done was, you know, voting for Trump didn't make me racist, but it did mean that you tolerated racism and you tolerated systems of oppression, and you kind of understood, I'm voting to keep that so. And there was a reason for that. If you unpack that, there's a reason why that happened in America. We still live in a very racialized society, and the reality is, for all of the, you know, reverse racism or identity politics conversation or critical race theory conversation, that racial hierarchy, those racial systems are still controlled and run by white systems. And so when we talk about dismantling that, there is a backlash to that. And there's a backlash to that, yes, white women have to sort of grapple with, how do we want to engage in those systems in a way where we are allies in a true way, we're accomplices in a true way, and we're not sort of picking, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, to uphold systems of white supremacy. And I think that's a difficult conversation for folks. It's a difficult thing for folks. The same way that I would say, as a man of color, there are places where patriarchy and things like that have to be unpacked in a way where I'm being fully cognizant of that. And I think those are the things that's where really the rubber hits the road. If you're willing to be vocal about something, are you willing to really take the impact of what it means to create spaces or open doors or give opportunities to people who do not look like you or are not like you in terms of your community and your direct neighbors or family members? And if you're willing to do that, I think it's also important that you know the why you're doing that. And if you do, which is where the critical race theory conversation comes from, I think that's what empowers folks to do that. And I think that's why, as a society, we've tried so hard. And when I say we, I mean our white sort of supremacist societies, to keep you from knowing the history about race. So, like, for instance, I just did a whole hour and never mentioned once that there was actually reparations in this country. It was to slave owners for the loss of their slaves. And we paid out of that, we paid about what would be the equivalent of $25 million today. Nobody's talked about that. And I think when we do that, so people are actually still sitting on, like, somebody got their slave reparations money that then got transferred down to their children and their children and their children. And so when we talk about this country and what that looks like, it looks like never learning that we did that, right? But thinking that reparations to actual enslaved people is a wild idea. And so when we talk about how we grapple with that, I think part of it is being very aware and accountable to the fact that whether you're conscious of it or not, everybody in America, for the most part, is conscious that being white in our society comes with inherent privileges and benefits. Whether or not they want to say that openly or privately or publicly, they're aware that these systems are built specifically to uphold and to benefit a specific racial demographic in this country. And all the data bears that out. And so it's not just, Ricardo Arroyo said that and it's an opinion. It's actually factual when you look at how the data has borne out. That's not because people of color are somehow, like when I was doing racism as a public health crisis, part of the problem is racists then turn that into, well, people of color are predisposed to illness. They're actually not, we're superior when it comes to how we deal with health. They just have these genetic health issues. Actually, they don't. That's actually not true. And if you ever listen to the 1619 Project podcast, and I'll leave you with this, actually post-slavery, there was a epidemic that was unevenly hitting communities of color, specifically Black Americans who had just exited slavery, and they did not give aid. This government did not give aid, did not give any funds to that because they believed that the natural predisposition of whiteness was that this was actually evidence that God believed that Black African Americans were not predisposed to freedom, and this was actually the natural correction of that they could not actually survive it or existed, and so that money given to that was actually wasted money. And so when we're talking about the harms that you need reparations for, how about letting people die post-slavery because they couldn't handle freedom? So we're not going to invest in public health. And so those are real decisions that this country has made. And I think that's like episode 3 of 1619 Project, if you want more details for that, because, and I'll just say one last plug, I represent Hyde Park, where the key person in that story, who's Rebecca Lee Crumpler, was the first Black woman doctor that we know of, officially licensed, came from Hyde Park. She actually moved to the South to deal with that epidemic because she understood that other folks were not going to do that. And she actually wrote a pamphlet that was about self-reliance, about, you can survive this. This isn't some unequal thing in you. This isn't something that has to do with your being Black or your inability to survive freedom. And that came from here. That's a Boston story, right? But raise your hand if you're in Boston and you've ever heard of Rebecca Lee Crumpler, right? Just so folks understand, last year, Hyde Park Historical Society raised money to put a headstone on her grave so that you can understand just what poverty looks like in this country. She had an unmarked grave. Her and her formerly enslaved husband had unmarked graves up until the year 2020 in this country, in this city. And so when we talk about what this looks like and who should be getting what and what things should happen, I think it's really important to ground it in the reality of sort of historical context and to understand what it means to stand on the sidelines and to sort of uplift white supremacy by simply not engaging to dismantle it.
Whew. Thank you. Well, thank you for that story.
It's less than an hour.
No. Well, I think so. What's really coming up for me as you're discussing is this, like, as a white woman, am I really willing to end white supremacy by any means necessary? And I think when we think of that phrase, we often think, oh, taking up arms. But I think this conversation really means that no, by any means necessary means a lot of things. And am I really ready as a white person to, when I say I want to end white supremacy, am I ready to do that by any way, by ways that might be I don't agree with, or I don't even understand, or I feel uncomfortable with? And so anyways, that just kind of phrased for me, and how do we, and this is kind of what our circle will be. You've given us so much I'm so excited to talk with people and unpack all of this, to talk internally about this, but also more importantly, how do we really engage in this conversation outside of the choir, to your point.
Yeah. And I think the biggest by any means necessary that I have seen hold back progress is, wait, you mean I got to lose my advantages? Because I didn't know we had those. And so when you get into sort of what this looks like, dismantling systems of white supremacy or systems that benefit sort of the history of white supremacy because of benefits or that you may have gotten sort of inherently that you just take for granted, like my great grandmother left a small amount of money for my dad, or they let him get a loan to start a business. Well, Black families in America who come from slavery did not have that inheritance from great grandparents because they were slaves and never actually, or enslaved people rather, and they were never given that inheritance to just do that. And then when it came time to buy a home, they didn't have access to the same programs. And then when it came time to get a job, they didn't get the same pay if they got the same opportunity. And so when we talk about those structures that have created that inequity, now we get to today. And what I see a lot, what holds back a lot of the work that we try to do is I'm all for equality in name, but when you actually make things equal or equitable, it turns out I didn't realize just how much of an advantage I was getting. And now when you're taking that away, whoa, that's impacting my child's admission to schools or my child's access to certain things, or that's impacting my access to things. I don't, or my family's, or some kind of trickle down way in which that impacts me. It's being comfortable with giving up something that you have, not because of any inherent gift or privilege or skill set that you have, but because there have been systems in place that have allowed you to have access to whatever those things may be in a way that is unequal or burdensome for other folks to get or achieve. And I think that's a very difficult, heavy conversation that has really been, to me, the biggest issue, and why so many things have had to go to court, why so many things have had to get done that way by force, in terms of forced court order. It's because folks don't willingly usually give up things in this country or in life. And so when we're talking about equal rights, yes, in theory, equal rights for me does not mean less for you. Equitable access to things should not mean less equitable access to you. It means equal access. And when we start to do that, we realize, well, actually, inequitable access does mean more access for you. Are you willing to dismantle that? Are you willing to do the work to actually give things up? And that's where, the rubber meets the road. That's where the hard work is. And so for me, it's trying to find ways in which we can give back societally. But I know that the biggest fights that we have is when you're targeting or trying to create a system that repairs past wrong, folks who very rightfully did go to graduate school, did do this, do have privileges, do have sort of these advantages that they've worked hard for, are unable to connect the dots as to why other folks did not get those things. They believe they merit these advantages because they've done hard work, because they've achieved and earned those things, but they do that without the context of what advantages were granted to them in access and funding and just life expectations and just being white in a society that gives access to white folks. And I'll just leave you with this. When I was in law school, a study came out, which I don't have accessible to me right now, but you can Google it, where folks with Black names, traditionally Black names, they did a study on this, weren't offered clerkships. Same grades, same schools, in some cases better schools, weren't offered clerkships for judges because of their names. They were frankly screened out in a way that was too dramatic to actually, and then within firms weren't offered partnership tracks, weren't offered jobs at firms on the basis of what their name was. There's all kinds of studies about what your name is and how that impacts your ability to excel in this country. And I'll just give you one last one from Boston. If you Google the Suffolk housing study, 72% of folks who attempted to, in a study by Suffolk, to find rental accommodations experienced racism in that white people who identified as white were shown more apartments, were actually given better rates, were actually responded to more often by real estate brokers than the same exact person using a Black name or saying that they were a Black person was not given access to those housing rights as 72% clip. That's here in the city of Boston for rents. And so when we talk about this in the context of, like, if you were getting really offended, if somebody's like hate watching this right now and they're like, what do you mean I didn't earn that? This is what I mean. I mean that literally saying in an email, I am a Black African-American person who can afford that rent, and you saying I'm a white Bostonian and I can afford that rent, and you get an email back and I don't get an email back. That's what I'm talking about. And so when we talk about those things, you're not aware of those things because you're not a person of color. But if you look at the data and you see that those things are happening, then you have to appreciate or understand that sometimes you are giving access or opportunities that people of color, specifically Black folks in America, because our racial hierarchy is based on how close you look to or are white. I experience a specific, I still experience oppression and all of those things, but I recognize that the oppression that I experience is sometimes lessened because of the fact that I am less a person of color in the sense that I am less dark than somebody else. And that's just a real thing. It doesn't mean I don't experience any of those things, but it does mean that I'm very aware that because I'm not immediately seen as a person who is Latino or a person of color just on site all of the time, that I may escape certain harms or issues when that occurs, right? And so those are the kinds of things that I think we have to reckon with. Those are the kinds of things that I try to deal with on a daily basis as an elected official, but you don't have to be an elected official to do advocacy. In fact, I would say a lot of advocates are more aggressive and effective than elected officials at times. So I'm hoping to see that kind of growth from here. I know there's good folks in this program, and I'm happy to come back at some point in the future about this or something else. But also, I'm going to make sure that I give you guys the tools as far as this hearing goes to engage your group and make sure that they know when and where to go for that.
Well, thank you so much. We could certainly take up many more hours of your time, and that's super generous of you to offer for you to come back. I'm sure we will take you up on that. I want to just say to our audience that we will be continuing this conversation at our circle this Wednesday. So please reach out to us if you'd like to join us at noon or at 7 p.m. Of course, look also for that information. We'll be spreading both through the circle, but also, as well through our regular email chain, and we'll connect with Councilor Arroyo with all of that information that he can provide with us, as well as additional information that we are collecting. Thank you again, Councilor Arroyo, for everything that you shared with us. Thank you to our audience. Hopefully we'll see you on Wednesday, and if not, we will see you all next month for our next live stream. So again, thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
And feel free, Lay. How do you pronounce your name? Is it Lay or Leah?
Lee.
Lee. There you go. Lee, you can feel free to share with your group my contact information as far as my email and stuff goes, in case there's other ways in which folks can get involved, or they happen to actually live in my district, which is Hyde Park.
I think we have a couple that do. So I think that would be great. And we're gonna share your clip also of your comments from the pre-hearing, and then we'll send information.
I'm at Ricardo N. Arroyo, just like the name, but with an N in the middle, on Twitter. If you're trying to be up to date on certain things, certainly for hearings and things like that, we shoot those out on our social media often. But I will make sure for this specific one, y'all receive a heads up prior to, and then it's on you to get everything.
Yes, we will, and we are happy to do that, and we will get that to you all for sure, and really appreciate you putting that extra work in. All right, well, again, thank you so much, and I'm sure we'll be seeing you again, and thank you all to everyone who tuned in, and have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.